today we're not so much talking about the issue anymore. We've done this in length yesterday, but of course I'm very happy that also some of the participants of yesterday's presentation are here with us, so we can maybe connect the two dates, the two presentations at the discussion later. We wanted to expand a bit further, so to go on from the issue, so that we invite additional people so they can say their 50 cents about what is Yugofuturism, or the problems with Yugofuturism, or so they can have their take on it. I don't know, I think this is the point of Yugofuturism, so that we have new and new circles, new and new invitations, new and new voices involved in it, and that we broaden it as much as we can, so that we can start to understand what it can be, what it could be. Today we will have 4 speakers, and the first one is Borisav Matić. Borisav Matić is a critic and dramaturg from Serbia. He is the regional manager editor at the Theatre Times. He is a member of the feminist collective Rebel Readers, Pobunjene Čitatelke, with whom he co-edits Bukvica, their platform for literary criticism, and creates print publications, literary shows, and podcasts. He occasionally works as a dramaturg or a scriptwriter for theater, TV, radio, and other media, and he's the administrator of IDEA, the International Drama, Theater and Education Association. I thought for today that we will have individual presentations, and after each presentation, maybe just short questions, and then after all 4 presentations, we will have a discussion with everybody, so there will be still time to also confront all of the ideas. Thank you, Borisav. Please, I'm very interested on your take on Yugofuturism.
Thank you, Pia, for the introduction, and special thanks to the whole Maska team who invited Rebel Readers to present at the conference. I am, as Pia said, a member of Rebel Readers, Pobunjene Čitatelke, and today I'm representing the whole group. So this presentation is a collaborative effort that I'm just presenting today, and Rebel Readers is a regional feminist collective that's engaged primarily in literary criticism, but also otherwise in culture and education. So I'm very happy that this theme of Yugofuturism is advancing, and that we had the chance to be part of that, because it's something very close to what we do. So as you can see here, the title of the presentation is From Yugo-Nostalgia to Yugofuturism to Utopia, or Utopia, Yugoslav Utopia, and I understand that it seems contradictory, even maybe absurd, that I'm talking about Yugo-Nostalgia at the conference of Yugofuturism, but I will try to prove that Yugo-Nostalgia is in fact closely related to futurism, as the subheading says, Yugo-Nostalgia as a futuristic and utopian impulse. So, yes. This presentation will first of all examine the concept of nostalgia and Yugo-nostalgia, as it is conventionally seen as a past-obsessed, passive, and even regressive phenomenon. But in recent years, and not only in recent years, but in the last 2 decades, there is a wide research field about Yugo-nostalgia that actually says that this phenomenon can be used as an emancipatory tool for us to imagine the better future, and perhaps to create some alternative, better realities. And it is also, it can also be closely related to the concept of utopia, not some imaginary utopias, but very concrete utopian impulses that existed during the second Yugoslavia and that we can use today to advance our society. So first of all, we will see what Yugo-nostalgia is from a conventional sense how it is perceived. As I said, it's perceived as passive, static, restrictive phenomenon that's oriented exclusively towards the past. And also from this, maybe someone can say that it's a very backwards, even conservative and traditional phenomenon that's focused on our past and not on the present and the future. Also, as we see here, one definition, we can also say generally about nostalgia that it is a paralyzing hope never to be fulfilled that puts its owner in a permanent state of wanting. And that is something that could be applied in this perspective to the concept of Yugo-nostalgia, conventionally speaking, but I will try to prove otherwise. And as Yugo-nostalgia has its criticism, so does Yugofuturism, which is a very young field that Maska only recently started to develop. And Matić wrote in this issue of the Maska magazine about Yugo-nostalgia that it symbolizes the general, almost apolitical grieving for Yugoslavia, and it is a sentimental phenomenon of the petty bourgeoisie. And she sees Yugo-nostalgia differently from Yugofuturism, which she places in the first years of the second Yugoslavia, immediately after the Second World War, and actually Yugoslavia that had the potential to create a better, even utopian society. And she says that this period ended in 1953 when the anti-fascist front of women was abolished by the state. And she says that the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia was the socialist realization of the communist idea, and that idea was excellent. But any attempt at future Yugofuturism would turn out to be a mere reinterpretation of the Yugofuturism of the past, or a step back rather than a revolutionary leap into the unknown. So she, in other words, says that if we engage with Yugofuturism, we are in a trap. And what's especially interesting to me is that she also says, in a way, this in her fiction, in her short story, 1740, from her short story collection Sladostrašće, which is actually a new weird genre short story set 20 years into the future, where the neighboring countries are flooded because of climate change. And a group of characters develops a time machine so they can go back to the past, to the 1960s, to meet Marshal Tito and Edvard Kardelj, and actually to convince them that climate change is a serious threat, so they can convince the non-aligned movement of the world to act on climate change and to perhaps stop it. But of course this effort fails, and by different circumstances, which I will not go into detail now, they actually end up in the 18th century, in a decadent period on the French court. So any attempt to go back to Yugofuturism and perhaps to get some positive social change out of it fails, according to Matić, her fiction and her theoretical writing. But this is something that I do not agree, even though I respect this, I do not agree with this, and actually what I will focus is on this growing body of research about Yugo-nostalgia that exists in the 21st century. And that says, according to Svetlana Borin, for example, that nostalgia is not always retrospective, that it can be prospective as well. The fantasies of the past, determined by the needs of the present, have a direct impact on the realities of the future. And also, as Maja Maksimović would say, the aim of Yugo-nostalgia is not to restore the country or the system that once existed, but to point out the flaws of the present society, and also to serve as a purpose of vision for the improvement, and thus possibly provide a better future for everyone. And this growing field of research in academia is present not only in the region, but for example in Austria, in Germany, in some UK universities, as we will say, but I will now focus mostly on Mitja Velikonja's research, who is a Slovenian academic who's working in the field of memory studies and cultural studies, and who has a lot of works examining Yugo nostalgia and its phenomenon. And he has a stance that Yugo nostalgia can be emancipatory, that it can help us progress in our societies here in the region. And he actually has 6 points how Yugo nostalgia can achieve that. First is criticism of the present state of affairs, because nostalgia is actually an ideological construct as almost everything else is, and it's not history, it's not historiography, but it's a part of memory, collective or individual, and that's a selection of things. For example, nostalgics tend to highlight the positive sides of the Yugoslav society, and exactly those positive sides can serve as a critique of the present state, that present state of affairs that has gone downside since the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The second big purpose is the defense of the past against current hegemonic discourses, and what he points out very cleverly is that all the nationalist and religious movements in the region are actually more hostile to the idea of Yugoslavism and Yugo nostalgia than they are to each other. So whatever nationalist movement you see in the region, Croatian, Bosniak, Serbian, Albanian, you can see, I mean, from Kosovo, you can see that they disagree on many things and they are hostile to each other, but not when we speak about the phenomenon of Yugoslavia. The third point is that Yugoslavia has a creative potential in culture and pop culture in general, in arts, that it can bring us closer for regional collaborations, but it can also inspire some very concrete artistic practices. Furthermore, it creates an option for new collective identification that goes beyond the nationalist identities that exist in the region and that have created a lot of conflicts in the past decades. And also from all of this comes the direct engagement in politics. For example, what conservatives and right-wingers understood throughout history is that nostalgia can be very actively used in politics. For example, in Britain, Margaret Thatcher and the conservative movement understood that. Ronald Reagan's movement in the US understood that. And they highlighted the glorious aspects of the national states and their past in order to strengthen their movements. Of course, these movements are completely different. The movement for socialism in Yugoslavia and the conservative ones, but the use of nostalgia as a political tool is basically the same. And the last point that Velikonja highlights, and that is the most important, is that nostalgia can be used as a utopian hope for a better future. And I will elaborate on this using the principle of hope from Ernst Bloch, who is a neo-Marxist scholar of the mid-20th century, and who actually says that the here and now that we live in is actually a repressive state of current affairs, and that the neoliberal capitalism wants us to know, actually to believe in, that this is the only option that we have, the here and now, where consumerism is ever present and there is no alternative. But there is alternative. I mean, if you look at his theory, and he says that the utopian impulse from change comes from the future and comes from hope. He locates hope in the future and as kind of a strive for a better society, for a more just and equal society, and these actually ideas that come, hopeful ideas that come from the future, disrupt our repressive present state of affairs, and they can help us in this positive social change. So, in other words, the utopian is there and then of futurity, and this concept has been used, for example, by Munoz, Jose Esteban Munoz, a theoretician of utopian studies and queer studies, who use this concept to say that the queer utopia is somewhere in the future. In other words, we are not still still queer. That queer is something that needs to happen and that needs to come from the hopeful future in order for us to actually elicit some social change. And this concept can actually be used for Yugo nostalgia and its positive social impact. And how does this happen? How do we say that Yugo nostalgia is something from the future? Simply because those ideas that existed in the Yugoslavia are well ahead not only of its time, but also of our time, of the social change, positive social change that happened in the second Yugoslavia is actually inspired by these futuristic ideas that are still futuristic in the 21st century. We can see that in the architecture of modernist architecture of Yugoslavia and how this futuristic idea is actually even very progressive for our current time, as we can see here. And there was recently an exhibition in MoMA called Towards a Concrete Utopia, MoMA in New York, about the Yugoslav architecture and the brutalist architecture and its utopian impulses and its futuristic aspects. So this idea is recognized worldwide, not only in the region. And not only architecture, of course, but for example, we have the Women's Anti-Fascist Front, which is the biggest, not only anti-fascist women's movement, but the biggest women's movement in general that happened in the region, and that we can learn a lot from even today. And many of the rights that were gained in Yugoslavia, especially for women and minorities, happened thanks to the anti-fascist women's movement. And actually we can see a backwards slide today in women's rights, in our rights in general. Some of them are, of course, the rights to abortion, the right for free and fair work, etc. So in a way, this is, even though it's from the past, this is an idea of the future that we haven't reached yet. And there's also an example of the labor movement, the labor ideas that existed in Yugoslavia, and we can see how positive and how futuristic it is even today in the slogan of the Bitef festival, which is "We the heroes of our own labor," and IETM conference, Work Hard, Live Harder. And we can point out that today in our repressive here and now, when we're burnout, where we have job instability and many other problems related to the job market and job sector, that we are not trying to fix this or to perhaps to change the current state of affairs with some contemporary theory or some innovative, some recent thinking, but nonetheless we use the slogan and we use the ideas that existed in the 1950s and in the 1960s that existed during the labor movement and youth actions that not only rebuilt the Yugoslavia, but also made an enormous progress and built not only cities but the whole infrastructure. And one last thing is a concrete example of how Yugo nostalgia can be a positive factor today, how it can inspire us to bring social change. This is a study of Monika Palmberger, who in 2008 went to Mostar to actually research how Yugo nostalgia, what the impact of Yugo nostalgia in Mostar. And as most of you know, Mostar went through a really difficult period during the war in Bosnia, and locals say that there were two wars actually. First one fought with Croatians and Bosniaks on one side, fighting the Serbian side on the other, and when the Serbian side retreated in '93, the other war broke out between the Croatian side and the Bosniak side, and even after the war ended, there was a kind of segregation in the city. But Monica Palmberger actually researches this the everyday life in Mostar, and she has the example of Sanja, who was born in 1983 and who doesn't remember a lot of Yugoslavia, but she remembers her neighborhood and her residential building that was actually of many nationalities, Serbian, Bosniaks, Croatians, and also some other minority nationalities, and she remembers how they lived in peace and how there were some mixed families. And in that Mostar of the 2000s, in a segregated Mostar, this actually memory of a better way of living, a more peaceful way of living, actually inspired her to go beyond this kind of segregation and to actually consider herself not only Croatian but also Bosnian, in a way that she sees also other people of different nationalities living in Bosnia as her co-citizens, not only just those with whom she shares the religion. And also Monica Palmberger says that unlike other people in Mostar, most of them, and unlike other people in Sanja's social group, Sanja actually has a boyfriend that lives in another part of Mostar, and that he's Bosniak, and that would probably not have happened if she didn't have this positive memory of the way of living in the 1980s in Yugoslavia. So that's one very concrete example, and since this is a very short presentation, I will stop now, but later we can talk a bit more if something was unclear.
Thank you, Borisav. Does anybody have an immediate question, or do we wait for the discussion at the end? Okay. Okay.
The images?
Oh yes. So the images, this is from an artist that her artistic name is Anio Mon, and you can find her on Instagram and also on her website, which is written here. This is, in a way, in a visual sense, a very Yugofuturistic approach, since she creates this collage of old pictures from Yugoslavia and combines them with elements from space. And yes, I really recommend all her works.
Thank you, Borisav. Okay, then let's just continue and we'll discuss all this stuff at the end. The next speaker is Hana Sirovica. Hana Sirovica is a writer and editor in the fields of performing and visual arts, film and culture. Her texts have been published in various electronic and print media and publications. She works as a journalist and co-editor of media outlet Kulturpunkt.hr and as a coordinator of World Around Us, a platform devoted to the development of art criticism in former Yugoslavia. She is interested in developing discourses that blur the lines between criticism, practice, theory, and everyday life. Hana, please.
Hello everyone, thank you Pia for such a nice introduction. I have not prepared a visual presentation, so you'll have to bear with my thoughts. And what I have prepared is actually, I borrowed from the proposal that is in the title of the conference. So I decided to swish through some of my association line out referential fields that opened up to me when brainstorming and thinking about what Yugofuturism can be. Before actually starting with that, I would just like to outline two positions that I think are important for what I will share with you. Firstly, I would like to stress that I am a cultural worker, working on everyday basis with organizations and individuals from what we call the region, what used to be called Yugoslavia. And I have been coming across consequences of those cultural connections also on everyday basis through my work. The other positions that I have to outline is the fact that I also have spent some years as a political organizer, mostly in relation to queer and feminist struggles, but also as a cohabitant of different scenes and communities, including what we now call the independent cultural scene, activist scene, leftist scene, and some others. Also, the footnote I would like to add to this introduction of my position is also the fact that during my education and work, I came across, which is of course also caused by lots of cultural connections and the systemic erasure of what used to be shared Yugoslav culture from our educational system and everyday culture. Mostly, the way my thinking has evolved has been mostly influenced by Western and mostly Anglophone thinkers. So, for example, learning about the left thought or Marxist thought has occurred through British cultural studies, or, for example, my learning process about feminism was also started by Western feminism online. That is kind of that has caused kind of a double bind, which I think will be evident in some of the things I will go through briefly right now. So I also wanted to point it out. Okay, so to start with the swish movement. These are some of the thoughts that the concept of UFO opened up for me. Of course, my goal is to show why I see it as a potentially fruitful strategy. Most notably in reclaiming cultural memory. And of course in reactivating potentially new ways of approaching both past and future. So firstly, we have heard a lot about nostalgia, both yesterday and today. But I have to say that nostalgia wasn't the first reference that comes to me when thinking about the relationship, the dominant modes of relating to Yugoslav heritage. What comes to mind first for me, and I will sketch it out a bit more detail right now, is actually melancholia or melancholy. But before, I think some of you probably recognize the reference to left melancholy. But before that, I would also like to point out one thing which is quite, which I think makes Yugofuturism different from other futurisms of similar kind. That are the futurisms that evolved as reaction and out of need to intervene in cultural memory, such as Hungarofuturism, Afrofuturism, or Sinofuturism. So all of those other futurisms are based mostly on ethnic identities that exist or that never existed, but then they speculate on how they could exist. And what makes Yugofuturism different, and what I find really interesting and potential about it, is that it's based on what is no more. So it has this kind of like backward and forward in the notion, in the term, in the word. It already has a backward and forward time orientation. And yes, so now I will continue with the Latin melancholia. I think that Yugofuturism opens up a way for perceiving potential for forming different relations that we cannot escape. And when I say we, I am speaking from a generational we, thinking about the generation that cannot, that don't have a living memory of Yugoslavia, but that grew up formed by memories of Yugoslavia present in culture around us. And when I say different, I mean different from the one of the dominant modes, which I label as left-wing melancholy. I will be brief about the melancholy because I think it's comprehensive enough in the term itself, but it has been defined by many actually thinkers as the attachment, as a political attachment to the object lost, and also marked by the strong relation of idealization for the past, and as an inability coming from that attachment, the inability to look forward, to be future-oriented. The thinkers that utilize left melancholy are mostly contemporary, but I would actually like to go back to the roots, to Walter Benjamin, who was the first to invoke it. Because what is quite often overlooked and forgot is the fact that he invoked it specifically thinking about arts and culture. It's a small essay, which was actually a critique of a certain kind of poet embodied by the figure of Eric Kästner in that case, but he was speaking about the type, not necessarily about Eric Kästner himself. And I would just like to read a quote that kind of did something for me when thinking about melancholy and about the relation to Yugoslavia. So he said, "Constipation and melancholy have always gone together. Since the juices began to dry up in the body social, stuffiness meets us at every turn." So I would like to leave you with the notion of constipation in relation to politics. Because, just leave the image out there for you, because I really feel it corresponds quite a lot with the dominant relation to Yugoslav past that I feel surrounded with in the communities I cohabit with. Of course, the other dominant relation which I want to address here because I don't have time would be nationalism, but I leave that to others. The second trajectory that I would like to move to now is that of historical futurisms, which I think is quite an important referential field opened up by the term Yugofuturism. And of course, I will skip Italian futurism because I don't see that much emancipatory potential in it. But I would like just to stress Russian futurism because of its demands for bringing culture closer to the people and for its search for new means of distribution and production. So, why I brought this up? Because I feel that if Yugofuturism is to evolve as a practice that is productive, both politically and culturally, I think it needs to follow that orientation. So, orientation not towards ideal of the past, but towards the now and the future. And the third referential field that is also the last one I will open at today. I won't spend many time on it because Borisav already said a lot about it, and I feel that others might as well. It's of course the orientation towards the future, the utopic orientation towards the future, which is something that I think a lot of us who started thinking about Yugofuturism obviously felt like a possible orientation and like an important source of potential of the term or the concept. And I am also going to actually finish with Jose Esteban Munoz, who Borisav mentioned, who is also my favorite theorist of utopias. Following the blog, he stressed out the need for hope. And stressing out that hoping for liberation is a need. Even though the conditions for it are maybe not yet there, and the phrase "not yet" is quite important for both Bloch and Munoz. And this is where I see the temporal possibility for Yugofuturism to be different than some other modes of handling Yugoslav legacy. And what I always found most striking about Munoz's theory was the care with which he digs up through the past, and he finds the big figments of past utopias in culture, in arts, and in everyday life alike. And I think that kind of movement, which includes playfulness as a strategy or an approach, move on towards finding spaces in between. In relation to our moments, a moment in time is a moment that needs to be invented, temporally and spatially in relation to what we call Yugoslavia. I will finish with a call that Munoz finishes his book with. His book is quite manifestly written. It's kind of like a manifest, and I would like to finish with that poem as well. He calls for us to collectively make a temporal distortion, to look for moments, to possibilities in our here and now where we can create that. So yeah, I will leave you with that, and then we can discuss afterwards.
Hvala lijepa, Hana. Does anybody have an immediate question? Or okay, so I think we just can proceed and then discuss it. Thank you for opening up all this interesting stuff. We have our next speaker, Vukan Marković. Vukan Marković is a junior researcher at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory and part of the Yugolab Institute. He's working on a doctoral thesis at the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of history and theory of history in the late 20th and early 21st century. The areas of specialization he deals with are the crisis of historical consciousness and discipline in the 20th century, temporality, theories of the West, as well as the question of the influence of the Anthropocene on the understanding of historical time. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to my previous speakers, especially to Hana, who mentioned both Walter Benjamin and Bloch. So now I need to reinvent part of what I wanted to say. I come here as Pia was so kind to say, as I represent the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and we recently opened up a new field of study, which is called Yugolab, the laboratory for the study of post-socialism and post-Yugoslav history. And I believe, I'm not sure for the region, but in Serbia this is the only academic place where we try to systematically discuss about the reality of post-Yugoslav time and space. And this is why I think it's really appropriate for me to discuss about Yugofuturism. And especially from the standpoint that as many contributors to the journal and as my previous speakers said, there is something really exciting about the term itself and about the concept of Yugofuturism. Whenever you come by new terms and new concepts, you are liberated to discuss them from a variety of standpoints. There's no school of thought, there's no previous literature on it. You can sort of you can freely discuss it from various standpoints. But what I think is really relevant here is that, you know, there clearly are two words in it, Yugo and futurism. Yugo, which necessarily implies something about the past, something that has happened, something that is no longer here, and futurism is clearly the idea of somehow synthesizing the past and the future. And this is especially interesting for a historian to discuss a past concept that has to be somehow translated onto the future, and to figure out whether we can sort of dialectically arrange those concepts in such a way to produce something meaningful. So when I was first asked to come here, when I started thinking about what Yugofuturism might mean and what Yugofuturism can entail as a term, as a concept, as an action, whatever, it kind of occurred to me that basically it's kind of the reverse of what history is doing. We are supposed to be doing when we speak about Yugofuturism. So if history is ascribing a meaning to the past, if history's job is to somehow interpret the past and give it an understanding, what we are asked to do with Yugofuturism is to project that past onto the present and onto the future, so that we make some sense of past, present, and the future at the same time within the same concept. And given the historical reality that we are living in, and given the past that can't be changed, I thought that this is somewhat paradoxical in its nature. To speak about a past that cannot be revisited and a past that can somehow be useful for our future. And this, what was mentioned, this link between forgetting and remembering does play, is a thing here, but what really matters, I think, about Yugofuturism in the historical context is trying to deconstruct the entire Yugoslav legacy in such a way that this legacy is not burdening our future. To that extent, this reminds me of Derrida's Messianism without the Messiah, trying somehow to live up to a certain concept without necessarily having that concept in mind. And it's kind of interesting because, as Pia said, I do philosophy of history, so I necessarily have to deal with these boring concepts that are not interesting to other people. But when we talk about Yugoslavia, it seems to be that we focus too much on a particular point in space, in time, the post, let's say, the period from 1945 to 1991. Whereas I think to understand the true, I guess, historical tragedy of our present and potentially our future, it is worth sort of realizing that Yugo, part of Yugofuturism, is not necessarily just a particular period in the past, but it is the way in which most of the peoples and nations in this region have been created. It's the telos of our history. So to an extent, who we are at least, and also I'm trying not to reduce the entire story on Belgrade-Zagreb axis, which is usually how things are done. But when we talk about the first Yugoslavia, when we talk about the 19th century, when we talk about the generation of Strossmayer, Ljudevit Gaj, Vukaragić and Njegoš, when we talk about the creation of the languages we speak and the states in which we live, we are talking about something that is inherently Yugoslav in its nature. For Serbs especially, for Croats to an extent, I think a bit less for the other nations, but the way our modern nation states were created in the 19th century is intrinsically connected with the idea of Yugoslavism. So Yugoslavia in that sense is the fulfillment of our history. Yugoslavia was fulfillment of our history, the, let's say, century and a half striving of little unimportant nations to find their place under the sun of freedom or whatever. So with the collapse of that, we are kind of having a paradoxical situation, because I think our position here is pretty much unique. For us, the history actually really did end. And we're confronted with a really unpleasant reality that life continues even when history ends. So the post-Yugoslav in our narratives and in our discourses is actually a post-historical perspective, where we are now, when we talk about our, let's say, connection to history, we are talking about how to escape it, how to remove ourselves somehow from history. And I think this is really important when we want to discuss the second term in Yugofuturism, which is futurism, or future. It's the idea that we are sort of not observing ourselves as agents in our time and in our space. Yugoslavia was built on this idea, these very, very small nations. There's one excellent article in the journal about the experience of a guy who talks to a Turk, and the Turkish guy notices that all of us combined have less citizens than one city of Istanbul, which is quite correct. So the idea is, 100 years ago, this region and the peoples living in this region built, let's say, fulfilled their history by creating this country with an acute understanding that they're doing something unique, that there's something exceptional about them. Whether that was founded or not, this is not the place to discuss it, right? Perhaps they were not, perhaps the communists and the previous generations really did not do something extraordinary, but nevertheless there was this narrative that we are somehow special, that what we are doing here doesn't exist anywhere, that what we are doing here is the avant-garde of history, that we are somehow building history itself. The problem when your history ends after you fulfilled it already is that now you have somehow to escape it. And this has a lot to do not just with the lack of this sense of exclusivity that we have. We clearly orientalize ourselves in every possible narrative we have. But it's how do you understand yourself within the wider civilization that we belong to? When the Yugoslav space, and I really like Hana's quip about, we call it region, or even worse, Western Balkans. We invent these names to call the space as if we are some sort of geographical feature. The point with this, in my opinion, is that we within the last 30 years after our history indeed ended, we have been trying to sort of realign ourselves with the rest of our civilization. Europe has usually been the constant for it, right? And Europe has been serving as the civilizational stamp of approval. Once you enter the European Union, you've got a stamp and you're civilized. This is what reminds me of, in my opinion, the best lecture given by, video given by Slavoj Žižek. We all know his work. This is one of the best things. He stands in front of the map of Balkans and he explains each of the Balkan nations, showing where the limits of the Balkans are. So if you ask the Slovenes, the border is on Kupa River. If you ask the Croats, the border is on Savan Danube. If you ask the Serbs, the border is east from us. And in the end, it turns out that there is no Balkans if you ask all the Balkan nations combined. This is the idea that if there is a future in anything related to this legacy that we carry, and as I said in the beginning, this legacy that we carry is actually us. It's the language we speak, it's the cities we live in, it's the entire existence that all the nations in this region have been living for the past much more than 100 years, because the concept is much older than Yugoslavia itself. This would require us to sort of realign our belongings and our identities, to realign our understanding of ourselves. And for Yugofuturism as a movement or as a practice, let's not call it movement, to work, it would require us to cease abandoning history and to sort of look into, it sounds rather pathetic, but it would mean look into our own backyard. The idea that we are somehow sharing language, that we are somehow sharing our culture, that we are somehow related to each other in a way that is more than just an outcome of our political past, is not enough for a certain sort of projection of what used to be, the projection of something that used to be in the past onto the future to work. The idea that Yugofuturism as a sort of historical concept or as a concept of our understanding of ourselves has a lot to do with how we understand ourselves in the larger scheme of things, how we understand ourselves in relation to Russia, in relation to Europe, in relation to North, South, East, and West. And herein lies the initial paradox. Yugoslavia and the entirety of Yugoslav idea is fundamentally based on the fact that we are exclusive, that it is us who are agents of our own history, and that it is us who produce history in one way or another. With the collapse of this idea, and with the collapse of this country, and I do believe it's a final collapse. I don't believe there is any integrative potential in here except Europe. The post-historical space and the post-historical age we've entered is more about, not necessarily talking about Yugoslavia and its legacy, but it's about us figuring out where do we belong and where are we going. As long as the Balkans remains a place from where we should depart, one way or another, there is no hope for Yugofuturism, and there is no hope for any idea of sharing a future legacy. Our generation, I also agree with Hana fully, when you say generational we, and what does it detail for us. We are not really entitled to Yugo nostalgia, right? I was born 3 years after the country fell apart. For me, Yugo nostalgia would be as if I was nostalgic towards Dušan's empire or something like that. So the meaning the legacy, the burden of history, and that Yugoslavia indeed is, for our generation, is more of a story about who we are now and who we want to become, what we desire to be in the future, rather than what this country used to be or what the legacies of the generation that went before us is. And in that sense, Yugofuturism is indeed an excellent concept. As I said at the beginning, new concepts, everybody has the right to talk about them. Artists, scholars, critics, whoever. And if such a concept invites us to discuss these things, to discuss what is our deep belonging, what is our sense of agency in history, what is our relationship to the world, Europe, civilization, region, whatever, then this is an exceptionally useful concept. This is a concept that is actually inviting a lot of creativity in many different fields, and in this sense, this concept or term, Yugofuturism, is actually opening the door towards, let's say, a deconstruction of the stories we had so far about Yugoslavia, and opens the door towards, let's say, a frank reflection towards what happened so far. On the other hand, Yugofuturism, as well as, it's pretty much a common saying that the best thing this country left us is its own culture, and the cultural growth of all the nations in this region that were left after Yugoslavia is really remarkable. Even if you take a look at the interwar period in the 60s, in the 80s, the huge cultural capital that this country produced in literature, in arts, in film, everywhere, is very deeply ingrained in our identity. But speaking of that culture, 10 years ago, if we were speaking about this, we would be speaking in same language. And here we are now talking in English. So there is a limit towards cultural legacy. And as time passes, it remains to be seen what is archaic in this culture and what remains to have power to inspire other people. Now, of course, I am a historian, therefore my job, clearly I would want to have our cultural legacy survive, otherwise I'd be out of job. But the truth is, culture is related to how we use it. Culture is not a given. And culture transcends, in that sense, cultural policies, because cultural policies are pretty much inferior to our usage of it. So, with this historical distance between the actual Yugo story, between the actual Yugoslavia, the actual experience of it, and in this age of uncertainty and let's say, historical eclecticism that we live in, it remains to be seen where we are actually heading. And I think this is the most useful aspect when we talk about Yugofuturism, because this is a term, as a sort of a meta term that can subscribe to it, that can integrate into itself this peculiar fluidity between the past, the present, and the future that we in the Balkans are experiencing acutely every day. So, to conclude, I'd say that Yugofuturism as a term and as an idea and as a concept is definitely, by far, one of the most creative things I've seen recently, especially in Yugoslav studies. But in terms of movement and in terms of action and in terms of us doing something about Yugofuturism, I'm afraid there's a larger job to be done, and this is for all of us to figure out where we're going and who we are. And perhaps our generation is different, but in the past 30 years I don't think anybody really succeeded in that. So with that pessimistic tone, I'd give the floor.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay, then we have our last speaker, Mladen Alexiev. Mladen Alexiev is a Bulgarian theater maker and writer based in Sofia. He has realized various theater and radio productions in Bulgaria, as well as several cross-media projects, and has been part of different independent theater productions in Bulgaria, Serbia, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. He's the co-founder of the first in Bulgaria Independent Theater Association, ACT Association, and artistic director of the first edition of its festival. And at present, Mladen Alexiev is head of the International Department of National Theatre Ivan Vazov, Sofia, Bulgaria. So, Mladen, here's the floor.
Thank you. Well, this was quite a heavy, actually, introduction, not really related to the topic. Thanks to the three previous speakers. Actually, this was really smashing now, like the previous presentation. I hope I will manage to kind of give my modest contribution in this context. I was just to clarify my point of speaking, of course. This introduction is one thing, but I'm kind of maybe the neighbor who is not part of the Yugoslavian space, so to say, but part of the post-communist space. In that sense, I have a particular presence within this conversation. So, yeah, I'm really glad to be here because all this entire effort that introducing this concept of Yugofuturism is, from my perspective, resonates deeply with my own, let's say, interests and intuitions. And I just wanted to start, maybe also to make it a little bit lighter, with a quote by a song. Today is the release of the new album by Bjork, which is called Fosora. And the first single from this album that was presented a few weeks ago has, I will quote part of the text of it. Are these not just excuses to not connect? Our differences are irrelevant. To only name the flaws are excuses to not connect. Our union is stronger. Hope is a muscle that allows us to connect. I thought it's a nice hymn to start my talk today, and actually I find the proposed notion of Yugofuturism very problematic in many ways. On one hand, but on the other hand, I absolutely can relate, and I'm deeply moved by the desire that I can sense has produced this effort. So I would like to introduce to propose this distinction between the desire, the underlying desire of this proposition, and the name, the title used for this proposition to be introduced in public. In terms of tactics, I think it's a very smart name, in the sense that it's really, how to say, there is a strong erotic quality of it, or there is a libidinal investment that it really evokes. It really made me an impression yesterday how the people from an older generation, they were expecting really to get a sentence or a clear definition, and they left kind of not satisfied from this place. Maybe it's happening now. And there was representatives of a younger generation who said that this is not so charming, it's not attractive, it doesn't relate, they cannot relate to this notion. So it's interesting to also note that this proposition has a certain generational outline or contour that can be further examined or put into question. Okay, well, a lot has been said. I will try to go somehow in some structured manner, skipping things that there's no need to be repeated. The things that were shared yesterday, from everything that was shared yesterday about the new issue of Maska's magazine and related to the topic of UFO, I just took note of a few things. To imagine a future, to restore the network that the transition has partially erased, to inhabit a new, this shared cultural space, and the strive for belonging and collective body in one way or another, which means to create a shared cultural space and a regional network. I think when I tried to formulate for myself the desire that I kind of share, this was a small, like, maybe most simple definition, which is of course very reductive. It reduces many of the things that are in the notion. I think that, at least to me, this proposition relates to the notion of locality, and the pandemic experience in the last 2 years and a half, I think, has brought another sense to another meaning of what a country is, what a city is, where do I live, is this my home, is this my surrounding, is this country functioning this way? So kind of this closed border situation of the lockdowns, I think, gave another, they stressed in some important manner the meaning of locality. And this is on one hand. On the other hand, of course, we have the question of resources. Now we have the war going on. Again and again, we are coming back to the need to be self-sufficient or to inhabit in a meaningful way our localities. No matter if we talk about natural resources, about sustainability, about dependencies in terms of economic relations. I think this need, the locality to be redefined, is very important, and it's underlying kind of, it exists in this proposition, and I find this as a kind of a very relevant moment to raise such a question. I mean, no matter if it is coined as Yugofuturism or as something else. So somehow I think this period evoked a certain sense of ownership to the places we inhabit, and something that, especially this group of people that we are here, or most of us, I guess, that we are traveling a lot or like dealing with many contexts, I think we tend to forget kind of this the question of belonging is kind of more abstract, is kind of blurred. Usually, at least in my personal experience with that. One specific lens to bring in terms discussing this topic. Last week I encountered a video installation by visual artist Kadir in frame of an exhibition called Care, Repair, Heal in Bau in Berlin. And what really struck me there was the content of this work. The work consists of two parallel interviews with two psychoanalysts, one which is Algerian and schooled in France, and one German psychoanalyst who is dealing predominantly with patients from Eastern Germany. And this parallel that Kadir Attia makes in this work was very kind of really striking because of the perspective it gave to the, somehow, let's say, the Eastern German perspective that it gave to the unification of the two, of East and West Germany. Why I say that in relation to this topic? Because I think that it provides a micro model of or a possible answer to the question of what really happened. Because I still think, after so many discussions about nostalgia, we have the nationalistic movements, we have like many things that are more often discussed. I think this, the grief and the loss, this so-called lived experience of the population is not really, how to say, respected. The dignity is not restored, and in this case, talking about generations, I'm very much talking about the generation of my parents, for example, but also, to a certain extent, I would address the dignity of the entire nation, the change of the self-perception, the image of oneself after these changes. Of course, I have in my experience Bulgaria, but I see, I mean, from what I know, I can draw this parallel. And a few things to know from this work, from these interviews. One thing is that actually, in a certain way, the people from East Germany felt colonized in their own country. It's a certain conclusion of this psychoanalyst. They have not been able to speak and defend themselves, so they were in a certain state of paralysis in defining who they are. They have started to feel excluded and not represented, being forced to enter a state of affairs that they didn't choose for. And actually, also striking detail that makes a reference to the title of the festival this year is the specific role of the bourgeoisie and the erasure of the worker. This was really, at least for me, it was quite something. The erasure of the worker, what is meant by that? Before the so-called transition, or before the change, before the fall of the wall, the workers have been represented everywhere, in cinema, in sculptures, in whatever works you name, in literature. Like there was a modeling of the society and a created environment to dignify somehow the labor and the figure of the worker. This has been completely, almost completely, entirely erased, and the role of the bourgeoisie, as it was commented, was very interesting, that the people that have been middle and upper class, somehow they had tools and knowledge to navigate the change better than, and resources, to navigate the change of the regime better than the workers who have not been that well educated or have not been, have the resources, such resources to navigate the change. Okay, and last thing to mention from this, like take out of this work, is the basic prejudice that is still persisting in Germany till today for the Eastern Germans as lazy, inadequate, disoriented, lacking ambition, simply dumb, unreliable, undisciplined and unproductive. I think this leads to why I'm saying that, just what I can imagine when we open up the topic of the future and of the, I don't know, region, if we call it. I think we also stumble upon this image of kind of the primitive or the savage that is somehow still in action, at least in my context culturally. It still produces very bizarre forms of, how to say, behavior, of social expression in the arts, but also in the social sphere. Okay, yeah, well, maybe these notes are for a really long talk. I will end here just to, I mean, maybe one last parallel. It was interesting to trace the history of the term Afrofuturism and in relation to this proposition of Yugofuturism. It's, as many other terms of this kind, it has been coined by journalists talking about black art and culture in 1993. And what he notes, somehow he is the unifying factor that he finds in his works is the need to find a voice to go with a counter narrative or with narrative that is not necessarily alternative but that is personal, to tell a story which is not supported and not represented into the dominant narrative of the state or the culture. So that's also very interesting and potent, I think, parallel in terms of asking questions what this is and where it aims to go. I definitely agree that the big questions actually are the questions to be asked. Where do we want to go? What unites us, let's say, or not unites us is not really the word, but what kind of states we imagine in which we live, what kind of society we do imagine even, and what kind of affiliation in terms of geopolitics we could kind of, where do we see ourselves, where do we stand? Yeah, okay, well, I will leave it here. If this line of thought is of interest to some of you, we will continue the discussion in a moment.
Thank you, Mladen. We will just have 1 minute of pause just to put the chairs up and you can stretch a bit and then we can sit down and then we continue our discussion.